record this just in case you want to, I say something to like right now and like maybe later tonight you want to look at it or look over it one more time. So what I do every year is I kind of plan out based on previous years really actual exams and DBQs. Now, this is not like obviously like a science because they, from what I've heard, is the College Board and their test writers, like they have pretty much written out like 10 years worth of possible DBQs, and they kind of like refine it. So the last, let's see, 5 years is in blue here. So last year was, or not last year, excuse me, I'll come to 2020 in a second. 2019 was basically, oh, you guys wrote that one for the practice exam. How did the progressive movement foster political change? And that one was pretty specific, in that it wanted to really focus on like the laws that were changed. Normally they're a little bit more broad. And so that might be something to kind of think about this year is maybe they do ask for like an economic impact or political. I don't think that they'll do political again, but you never know. Okay. So this was in 2019. In 2018 was from a similar time period. It was basically imperialism. So we wrote this DBQ. I think it was the first DBQ that we wrote. We did it together. It was basically the causes of why the United States became an imperial nation, right? Like why it had like the Spanish-American War in there. It had economic imperial. It's kind of that 3Gs. You guys remember what I'm talking about? Where we were the kind of the economic causes, the political causes, the social. So it's more broad, okay? The year before that was women's rights. And some of you guys wrote this one. If you were in first period, this was your DBQ that you wrote this past week. And it looks at like from like basically World War II throughout the 1970s, like what were the causes of the women's rights movement? And then the year before that, it was early. It was American Revolution. I think this was my second year teaching it. And it looks at, I thought this was a hard one, the extent of change in ideas about American independence. So they wanted you to talk about what was the tipping point leading up to like the American Revolution that really changed people's minds about being loyalists that were kind of complaining about taxes and representation to actually deciding that we needed to declare independence and form our own government. And so that one I think was a little bit difficult. And then the year before that, a lot of people were upset about this one because it is very modern. Explain the reasons why new conservatism rose to prominence. So it's a lot of period 8 moving into period 9. A lot of teachers around the country, like you saw how quickly like we had to wrap things up. And so a lot of teachers hadn't taught that yet that year. And so what I did is I like to put it on a timeline and I like to look for holes, right? Now, if you look at 2020, from what I remember, and I can't find these prompts anywhere, they are under like lock and key, even though I got to see them last year. I was not thinking, and I did not save the prompts or any of those student essays that, because I was actually able to look at them. They wanted us to find cheaters. But I do remember one of them was about expansion, manifest destiny, like causes of the Civil War. One of the prompts was like how slavery changed over time. And it went from like the late 1700s through the mid to early 1800s. So basically what they wanted you to do there was look at like in the founding era, how did the founders view slavery? Remember we talked about how they thought that it would eventually just kind of die out because it wasn't like a major economic, it affected the economy of the South, but it wasn't like what it was like during the antebellum period, because there was a major turning point around 1800, and that was the cotton gin. And they really wanted you to look at how things were different. That's that anytime they ask about change, So even here, like think of like a turning point. What was the turning point where things were different? So for the American Revolution, it was,
Was tolerable acts.
yeah, intolerable acts and like common sense, um, kind of that view, or that influence. With slavery, it was going to, it's the invention of the cotton gin and kind of like, chattel slavery. Um, and that's going to happen around 1800. So that was one. And that my students, that was not on my radar at all. And then one that really surprised me, because we had a progressive era one the year before, but this one, if I remember correctly, it was, so where this is the effects of the progressive movement, this one was causes of the progressive era, I believe. And so this would be your Gilded Age, industrialization, monopoly prompt. Okay. Um, and again, I think a lot of students weren't expecting that one, because a lot of their teachers probably said, oh, last year's was the progressive era, like we're not going to review that. So these are in red, but you'll notice that they're from this time period, of the 19th century. And most of the ones that I've kind of like picked today, that I was just like thinking about what it could be about, and I could be completely wrong, like completely, but at least this will, hopefully will be land somewhere in there where it'll at least help you on maybe some short answer questions or the LAQ or even multiple choice questions if I'm completely off on the DBQ. And I would love to hear what you guys think. But again, there's a big hole in the 19th century. And then even if you look here between, I mean, you have women's rights. And so this whole also made me think like, okay, well, what could it be about? Because you have like social movements, right? Like kind of like cultural, and obviously it's connected to politics as well. This is connected to politics. This is foreign policy. And so that's going to be one of the reasons why I pick one of these options. So I created this document and I'm going to put it on the review. Okay. One of the first ones that I thought of, because I was trying to think this time period, in the early 1800s. And I might even add to this a little bit later, but these are just the first things that popped into my head. And when you like, how do I think about this, right? So one is it needs to be broad enough to where kids that have no idea what the heck is going on all year, can at least be, they can recognize some of the documents and at least take a shot in the dark. Does that make sense? And so, and then also there has to be enough like SFI related, like a lot of like terms kind of related to it to give kids those opportunities. And then also you have to create an opportunity for kids to be able to earn that unicorn point, the complexity point. So to be able to make connections across time periods. And you can't, I mean, a lot of history you can, but super specific. But I tried to pick ones that were big enough and kind of like easy enough for kids that maybe didn't have a teacher that prepared them enough, or, that they could still be successful. So I looked at, and I was wanting to look too for something about the economy, because you'll notice like on that timeline, like there wasn't really anything specifically related to the economy. The progressive era one kind of influenced me a little bit there. But maybe transportation, or something to do with westward migration a little bit, and how that led to like political, what I just do, democratization. And remember, like, so if you came to the reviews, we talked about how the Erie Canal really opened up that Northwest territory for the economy during the early market revolution. But the long-term effects of that politically is that people were moving into those new states, or they were territories, because they had economic opportunity. And the effect is going to be that they get to write their own state constitutions. And then that's where you have universal white male suffrage, right? So lots of causation there. And then you have opportunities to go like an economic route, a political route. And I kind of like, as we were doing a lot with like interstate highway system too, just one of those, like, again, one of those examples of like making connections across time periods. Like for the complexity point, you could talk about how interstate highway system, right, this government subsidized, just like the railroads, just like the canals, was subsidized by the government or to help stimulate the economy. And you would have to say more than just that to earn the complexity point. You know, you would have to go into a little bit more detail, like maybe 2 or 3 sentences, but depending on what your thesis is and what the prompt is, you could definitely do that. So Erie Canal, when looking at how the economies were different, so this is a period of time with like economic nationalism. I'm actually going to write that down. That's good. So like Henry Clay's American system. You guys remember that? Nope. It was the idea that the federal government should, and this was like, what do we call them at this point? I guess these are the Democratic Republicans, but they took on this federalist view of the job of the government is to aid business in some type of way. It's almost like an extension of Hamilton's economic plan. And investing in transportation systems that way, for sure help the economy of that time period. What do you guys think? Any questions about that? Does anyone just like straight up hope that that's not it? I think this is one of the harder ones.
I really hope it's not that transportation one. That one seems awful.
But you never know how you would do with the documents.
Yeah, but like still, I just so do not
Yeah.
know.
Okay, so that was one of my thoughts. And again, I'm trying to look at things in the 19th century. I think you guys will nail anything in the 20th century. If it has something to do with the Cold War, especially, which could totally happen. Like if you look at this, like it could be Cold War, but we've written 2 now related to the Cold War. So I feel good about that. And again, you guys are doing the in-person one. I think that you guys are probably at an advantage. Like I think that they're gonna excuse me, you guys are gonna get the DBQ that they wanted to give, right? Where I think that the kids at home are just gonna get like some stuff like thrown together because they're gonna have multiple they're gonna have a lot of different, probably 3 to 4 different DBQ prompts. And then each prompt will probably have a range of like 15 documents. That's what they did last year. So even if like you're texting your friend and you say, hey, I got the Manifest Destiny DBQ, and your friend says, hey, me too. And you say like, well, what did you do for document 3? And they tell you what they did. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's probably because the documents are different. So I think that you guys are going to get one almost like a softball. I hope it's a softball. So yeah, that one might be a little bit more difficult. Okay. I'm really feeling this immigration one now because again, this is going to be in the 19th century. It can, in the time period that could vary. They could limit it between 1860 and 1900. They could do that for sure. Because once you get into 1817, that's World War I. And remember, like that would be really good, like complexity, because like down here, I talk about xenophobia. There's just, and the reason I'm really liking this one is because you have so many opportunities. There's a ton of SFI. It kind of gets into the progressive, like, movement a little bit in that urban life during this time period was so bad that it's going to be part of the inspiration for the progressive movement. And I like it too, because you have to have some of that knowledge of that industrialization, which again, like if you're looking at the big hole on that timeline, this could be it. I think it could be very simple, right? Like what was the impact of immigration on American society between 1860 and 1900, like something kind of like that. And so if it is something like that, so that would be like causation. I think you guys are gonna get a causation one because that's the easiest one. And depending on your documents, you're for sure gonna want to talk about the rise of nativism, xenophobia. So that's kind of like a political thing, right? You have like, depending again on like when it is, you know, the Know Nothing Party was in the 1840s and 50s. I'm actually going to put that here just in case. Because if your time period starts in 1860, Know Nothing Party would actually be like contextualization, like that wouldn't count towards SFI. Okay. Do you guys remember the old immigrants versus the new immigrants? Does that sound familiar at all?
Is the old immigrants idea like people that like the original American colonists, like the people that came early versus
I thought the old colonists were like those like literate ones that moved like into like that Northwest Ordinance land.
Yeah,
like
so
like
older immigrants are like 1840 or earlier, and they're going to be wealthier. Or when I say wealthy, I don't mean like upper class. I just mean that they sold everything in Europe, and
like they don't live in slums like
they're not. Yeah, they were literate. They had skills, like a lot of farmers, and a lot of trade, like people in trade, like merchants. And so when they came here, so Germans, Scandinavians, obviously English, the Irish are the only group in that old immigrants that were discriminated against. And that's because they were Catholic. But that's kind of like your Irish potato famine situation as well, as they're looking for like refuge almost. And so, yeah, it kind of is. So someone asked in the chat, like, is it basically, I don't want to say like racism, obviously, because they're all white. But it was definitely a socioeconomic thing. In addition to that, though, the people in the early 1800s or mid 1800s, they're coming over here, they're seeking economic opportunity, and they're spreading out, right? They're moving into the Northwest Territory. They're moving, you know, to Texas and places like that. They're kind of taking advantage of that opportunity. A lot of them assimilate. A lot of them learn English. And even though, yeah, they were probably like looked down upon as like others, but most of them were also Protestant. That's very important, right? Whereas after, you know, the Civil War, during the Civil War, I would say, if not a little bit before, well, actually, those are probably still the same. The Germans were still kind of like discriminated against, but as long as they spread out and assimilated, they were okay. However, after the Civil War, these new immigrants, pretty much around the 1880s through the early 1900s, travel has changed immensely. It's a lot cheaper to get here, especially those one-way tickets. And you had a couple different things that happened. One, you had like single men, young men coming over here, working, saving money, and then sending it back home, or like buying tickets for their family to come over. A lot of them are from Eastern Europe. Okay. They're poor, they don't have any skills, so they're looking for jobs in these factories that have taken off between 1860 and 1900. And there's a demand for those jobs. And there's also a demand for consumers to purchase the goods that they're making in these factories, right? Our economy is changing in that we have become so efficient and productive. And that will just continue, obviously, is that we're looking for people to purchase these things. So immigration was very important for our economy in that we had people to purchase it. So if it's asking about the impact of immigration on American society, there might be something about the economy in there with those documents. And then also kind of pay attention to.
Are these your birds of passage, like the new immigrants?
So a bird of passage was someone that came here, worked, saved enough money, and then would go back home.
They ever come back, or did they just go back like permanently?
It kind of depends. Some of them were just looking to get enough money to be able to like make their way out of a dire situation back in their home country. But again, like we also had a lot of Jewish people that were coming here during those years, a lot of Eastern European, like Orthodox religion, a lot of Catholics, so Italians, Croatians, Polish. They're more different than the old immigrants, and they're coming in by the millions, and they're not spreading out into the frontier and assimilating. They are clustering in industrial cities, forming neighborhoods that add to the discrimination because they're isolating themselves. And that's going to be one of the effects, is that there's a ton of xenophobia. Now, another group that is about racism was the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, that's not really happening because of what's going on in the cities, like on the East Coast with industrialization. That actually starts on the West Coast with the railroad, right? Or in mining towns where whites looking for economic opportunity are upset that they're in competition for jobs with the Chinese. And the Chinese were paid less. The Irish were paid less. They were discriminated against in that way. And so think about what that does for the labor movement. So that's kind of the economic component of this, is that back then, before Fair Labor Standards Act, before, which is minimum wage, wages were decided by the supply of labor. And so if the supply is really high of people like looking for jobs, especially poor people from Eastern Europe or from China, they're willing to work for whatever wages that they can take. Where a lot of like nativists, like Americans, right, were trying to make movement with the labor movement. They're trying to organize. They're trying to use collective bargaining. And if they go on strike, you have poor immigrants that are willing to work those jobs. It's counterproductive. And so there was a lot of discrimination against immigrants because of that. Now, there were other reasons, though, and that would be some complexity, actually, if that was kind of one of your arguments. The immigrants were kind of a scapegoat because, in addition, at this point in time in history, during this Gilded Age, is that the government and the courts, the laws sided on the side of business, right? It's not even like there were other things going against the labor movement in these years besides the fact that immigrants were willing to work for the wages that native-born Americans weren't willing to do. And then like the social impact, like within these cities and urbanization, the poverty, the crime, the dirt and filth, tenements, remember all of that? And so those are going to be some of the things that are going to lead to the progressive era. And then obviously, if you're looking at for nuance and synthesis, xenophobia is a continuity in American history. It started back with the Alien and Sedition Acts, back when John Adams was president. It's going to happen during the first Red Scare. After World War I, very similar kind of situation. So I like this one a lot. It's from the 19th century. It's definitely period 6. But I think that you just have a lot of opportunities if they keep the prompt simple enough and if they pick the right documents. Okay, so one of the questions was, can you, Second Great Awakening for contextualization, because like that was like a Protestant movement. Yeah, I think that would work. That's good. That's good thinking. Yeah, especially if somewhere in your thesis you argue that they were maybe discriminated against because of religion, then that would be really good contextualization. Could the whole house be used as complexity for New Deal as a type of reform of the past? So those are two different things, because you have private, like Whole House was like an organization that was created to help people, where the New Deal was a government, like the federal government. So be careful with things like that. Yeah. Anything else that I'm missing for like related to immigration that kind of maybe stood out to you guys? What do you think of that one? You think you guys could do that one? No. Yo, really? You think that one's hot? Okay. Oh dear. Okay, so you don't like that one. All right. So my next one, I don't know how I feel about this one. I was trying to look for a 20th century, and I was trying to think, about the government, because like looking at the timeline, like something in here, like this is like, I mean, you could always have like a civil rights, and I'll get to civil rights in a second. You know, this is very specific towards women. You wouldn't want to get too specific where it was like, it could be like causes and effects of the Great Depression. I think you guys would do great on that one. Don't you guys think? Possibly causes and effects of the Great Depression. And I can even type that one up if you want me to on this document.
Effects just be like a rise in like liberalism kind of thing. Long
term, yeah, that like government, yeah.
Like of like Keynesian economics, and then like
yeah, that would be like if you were looking for complexity in some type of way. Just the idea, and so that's why I picked this, right? So I said, like, evaluate the extent of the federal government like expanded its role in the 20th century, something kind of like that. Where you look at the New Deal, which again is going to be, you know, great society like built off of the New Deal. Even if you look at like internationally, I was even thinking that way, where, you know, how we mobilized for World War II, and then like also even like mobilization for the Cold War. I feel like you guys would do really well with anything in the 20th century. So I didn't like spend too much time thinking about it. But so what, Lee, like what you were asking me about the New Deal and like the progressive era. So instead of like Jane Addams' Hull House, you could look at like how early progressives, that like what FDR was arguing for, and especially what Johnson was arguing for, is remember that the Progressive Party, so this is like Teddy Roosevelt, right? Like early 1900s, they realized that the monopolies and, you know, the slums and the urbanization, like there are all these problems in society that need to be fixed, and the free market isn't going to do it, that the government needs to step in and pass some laws to fix government corruption, to fix the economy in like with antitrust. And then also state and local governments try to improve depending on what the problems are that plague their cities or their counties. Like some of the, you know, like for example, like New York passes laws about tenements, right? They say, no, like you need to have a window because that's how if you spread diseases, people in close quarters. But this is the first example of how the federal government really steps in. And so that would be good contextualization for an essay about the federal government. If you're looking for complexity, again, like pretty much every unit we've talked about this constant argument about the role of the federal government. It goes back to the Constitutional Convention, Articles of Confederation. You can talk about states' rights. I like a nice specific, you can talk about Jefferson and Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans, loose versus strict interpretation of the Constitution. Like that's good complexity. And remember, the complexity all depends on your argument, right? So if you're arguing that, you know, the large federal government benefited American society in the 20th century because blah, 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 in your complexity point, you would want to argue like Hamilton believed, like Johnson and his Great Society, Hamilton believed that a strong central government was necessary to support the economy and the people, like his financial plan that, you know, brought us out of economic turmoil after the revolution. Like it would need to be specific and it would need to support your argument. It's not like you can just casually reference these things. So far, I've had a few kids on this last DBQ that did a good job kind of like dancing around it. And like, I could see what their train of thought was. They just need to be a little bit more specific and connect it back to their thesis. So I gave you guys half points for those, but that's great. I love that you're trying for that complexity point. I think you guys are completely capable by this point to get it. So that's for sure today why I wanted to show you a couple examples of it. All right, what do we think about this one? I think you would nail anything 20th century. No, maybe, possibly. It could be causes, effects of the Great Depression. I'll type that one up too for you guys. Any questions about causes, effects of the Great Depression, just while we're here? Okay. Am I overwhelming you guys? Yes, no?
No, it's fine.
Okay. All right. Now, as I was working on this one, I was like, ooh, this would be a good one. All right. We're going back to the 19th century again. I don't know the years, what they would do on this. And this one's a little specific, but there's so much information that you could include in this. Evaluate the relative successes and failures of Reconstruction. What would you do if you read that prompt?
Be happy.
Okay, all right, I like it, right? As you start to look at it, right, and you would start to think about like brain dumping, like what Reconstruction was is after the Civil War, the radical Republicans, the people like Thaddeus Stevens, they're like, listen, the South is in shambles. We have ruined their economic institution, their social institutions, their political institutions, and we have to put it back together. We need to come back together. And in particular, the radical Republicans, their number one focus was, what are we going to do with the freed African Americans who have been enslaved for centuries and that have nothing? And how do we as the federal government protect them? And how do we as the federal government provide opportunities to them? Now they're radical. They believed in equal rights, right? They're the ones that passed these 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. 15th Amendment was extremely radical for the time period. And the only reason they were able to get those passed, you guys, was because Southerners were not allowed to vote at this point in time, right? And the only way that they got moderate Republicans that were still white supremacists, like, let's be real, they were, the only reason they got them to vote in favor of these things is because they realized that soon the Southern white Democrats are going to get to vote again. And they realized if we give African American men the right to vote, what political party are they going to vote with? Or which political party do we want them to vote with? The Republicans, yeah? And so they said, yeah, we definitely need to get them the right to, it wasn't because they believed in this equality. It was more about the fact that they knew that it was a new voting bloc that would be voting Republican for decades. Does that make sense? It was about kind of like political power, okay? And that's how they got the moderates. The biggest thing and why I kind of like this is because it would be perfect comparison to the civil rights movement. Is here you have an example between 1865 and 1877 where the federal government is passing legislation telling Southern states how they have to treat people, right? And that's the same thing that happened in the civil rights movement is federal government's passing Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and they're saying, listen, you can't discriminate. You've been doing it through Jim Crow, and that's going to be one of the negatives, right? That's one of the failures of it. Is again looking at how the federal government and states kind of interact in these different periods of time. And so what made me think of this one was, if we're looking here again, I was like, oh, would they do a civil rights one? I was like, maybe not, because it's kind of similar to women. But again, like looking here, there's that synthesis, there's like making that connection. Maybe that would be a good one. And I think there was a Reconstruction DBQ, like maybe like 15 years ago or something. So I know that that's like in their thought process. Anyways, and then I just listed out all this SFI. What do I need to go over with Reconstruction? Anything on here where you're like, hey, Ms. Cruz, can you go over that? Oh, I know what I need to go over. So they passed these amendments, okay? And are the states enforcing them? Is the local KKK member that also happens to be the sheriff, is he enforcing voting? Right? No, they're not. They pass a series of black codes. The difference between a black code, just FYI, and a Jim Crow law, black codes were before 1877. Jim Crow laws were after 1877. So black codes were like state laws that limited the scope of these pieces of legislation. If you're wondering why a lot of free African Americans ended up in jail after the Civil War, it's because they passed laws like you had to work for a white man and you couldn't take out a bank loan and you couldn't carry a weapon, like laws like that. And so the Republicans in Congress caught wind of this and they're like, hey, states, like you need to enforce these laws. And the Southern states are like, yeah, okay, whatever, make us. And so they did with the Military Reconstruction Act. They sent the soldiers back down into the South to enforce these laws. And so the effect of that is Black men are voting and they're electing Black officials and they have representation in their state, local. Hiram Revels was a senator, Black man from Mississippi that served in Congress. And this only existed, though, you guys, until 1877, right? So you could, because when in 1877,
Didn't
the federal
they compromise so that they would extract the troops so Hayes could be stay as president?
Yep. Basically, what Southern states did is they made a because voting was a hot mess in 1877. The economy was really bad in 1877. Panic of 1873. Anyone? You don't need to know what it was, but basically, as long as you know that the economy, what is wrong with me? That the economy was not good. So the Republican Party, they weren't worried about African American rights anymore. They're like, oh yeah, I'm sure it's fine in the South now, right? Like that racism stuff's over. They won't discriminate anymore. We did our part. And so they do the Democrat. So the 1876 election, where you have Hayes, who was the Republican, and basically you have a couple states, Florida, of course, where they weren't sure who won and they were going to have to recount and do all of these things. And basically what Southerners did in Congress is they said, hey, hold the phone. Like, yeah, we're waiting on Georgia. It was Georgia and Florida. But let's not even worry about figuring out where those electoral votes go because it was really close. Instead, us Democrats will let Hayes be president as long as you promise to pull all the troops out of the South. And the Republicans are like, sweet, yeah, we'll take that, because then they can pass all of their tariff legislation and, the president will sign it. And so the troops come out in 1877, and that's that return to home rule. You have Wilmington race riot, where you have actual coups that overthrow democratically elected Black Republican county seats and, town council, like all those things. They're called the Redeemers, that they were going to redeem the South. They're going to take back that power. And slowly but surely over the next 10 to 20 years, depending on where you are in the South, white supremacists and Democrats start working their way back into the local state elections, back into the House of Representatives and into the Senate. And they do that by passing laws that limit African Americans from voting. In order to even get to that point, though, they're using the Klan to intimidate African Americans who had previously been voting. And then also the Supreme Court is going to uphold that, right? The Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson and all of those slaughterhouse cases are going to, this is a really good word, limit the scope of the 14th Amendment. They're going to say, oh, yeah, well, equality, because that's what due process and equality. They're like, oh, equality. Yeah, sure. Fine. Separate. It's fine. As long as it's equal, then this is the 14th Amendment. States can decide what is equal, as long as it's equal, and then they can have separate facilities. And it'll be that way up through the 1960s. And again, that would be, and again, even today, you guys see like what's going on with, the Voting Rights Act has now been retracted by the Supreme Court. That basically the Supreme Court in 2013 said, oh yeah, the racism, it's gone, it's over with. Like it won't discriminate against people of color in voting anymore. And so the parallels there, it would just be an interesting one if they chose that. Regardless, that could be an LEQ too. That would be a good LEQ. And now you know all of that. But that's what I prepared. What questions do you have? Anything about Reconstruction? Where should I put this document? Let me put it in the chat. Is that the easiest way to do it?
Yeah, probably.
Make sure my shared settings are okay. Let me do anyone with a link. Hold on, let me do anyone with a link. Okay, there they are. Yeah. And then y'all can make a copy of it and y'all can like print it out and look at it tomorrow. You can, whatever you want to do. How else can I help you? Make you feel more confident? What do you guys think?
Like, what units do you think we should focus on if we try and get some studying today? What would you say are the main ones?
So it used to be that there were certain ones that were more heavily weighted. Now what they do is periods 3 through 8 are all, what did I say? Like
they're 10 to 17.
10 to 17.
But there are some that are definitely tested heavier than others.
Yeah, I can tell you what it used to be. You're more heavily, and that was on my review slides. It used to be that period 3, so the American Revolution, was weighted heavier. Okay. And then unit 5 or period 5, so like the Civil War, like not just the Civil War, but really understanding the causes that led up to it, right? That as we're expanding across the country and we are adding states, the slave states and the free states, that division and the competition between, or that increasing sectionalism, that's really important. Again, you're not going to have a ton about like, they're not going to ask questions about battles. I would be highly surprised. Like, I don't think it's ever happened. They will ask with wars, the effect on the home front or the effect on women or minorities, civil liberties, right? If you look at the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, especially, like there is multiple examples of how civil liberties were limited during a time of war. Even the War on Terror with the Patriot Act, which I know we didn't get to, but I'll just throw that out there now. Do you guys know what the Patriot Act is?
Like a male-dominated society.
No. The Patriot Act was passed. It basically allowed the government during the War on Terror to search emails and listen to phone calls without a search warrant, based on certain like keywords, right? So if you email a cousin in Saudi Arabia talking about a bomb, right? Like you're flagged. And then from that point on, like all of your phone calls and correspondences was listened to. Where a lot of people say like, well, just don't have a cousin in Saudi Arabia and talk about bombs. Like, but it's that slippery slope, right? The same thing with Shank and, tearing up a draft card, Korematsu with internment, during war, your civil liberties, there's that example of where the government and it's being upheld by the Supreme Court, that it's during that time of war, you don't have civil liberties. So that's something that they might ask questions about. The other units are going to be like probably period 8 and period 7. But again, period 8 with the Cold War and the civil rights movement, I feel like you guys should be pretty good on all of that. So if I were you and you're looking for content to review, period 3 might be a good one with the American Revolution, because it's been a hot minute since we've really talked about that. And the founding, like if I was talking about Jefferson and Hamilton a while ago and you were like, I don't remember any of that, that's in time period 3. Because again, looking at that continuity of the development of political parties and this argument about federal government and state governments, that would be a good one to look at. Other than that, I mean, there's no cramming for this. I would pick a couple, maybe a couple time periods to look at. Definitely brush up, like look at over that rubric for the DBQ. You can always look at those previous, do you guys know how to find the released AP exam FRQs on the website? Let me put that in the thing real quick. I think this is it. So this website, I mean, it's all the things, like just, these are all the things that I've gone over, right? Like, you know, it's 55 multiple choice questions. It does say though, you know, like the short answer questions, like what time periods it's from, you know, you get to choose just in case you want to look over any of that. This is a lie. It says 2020, like it's an AP classroom question bank. That's a lie. They're not there. And it's because they want, I think that they want to use something similar this year, but you can look at these free response questions that I mentioned. Even if you just want to look at how the short answer questions will go. These are the ones that you guys did on the practice exam. But you can look at the scoring guidelines. Here are student samples of, they should have student samples that scored well. So you can look at that. Like these are these are kind of the things that you're probably gonna, if you're studying today, I think that these would be good. And then you can click on past exam questions and they'll go back then, like basically that's how I kind of created the timeline. But like, for example, if you're like, oh, American Revolution, I don't remember if that's 2016 or 2015. Let's take a guess. Like you could go back. Nope, that's women. Anyways, you could look at those if you wanted to, or you could see like, all right, this student scored a 7, right? Like how did this student earn the complexity point? All of that is open and there for you. So I will share this website in the chat as well. Possibly. All right, how else can I help you guys? You're gonna do great. You really are. It's pretty impressive. Y'all are doing as well as you are with this crappy year, this crappy situation. So I'm proud of you no matter what. Tomorrow's just any other day. We can get lucky or we could not. It's just a test, right? Any questions about anything for tomorrow? Yes, Cameron, I can. Yeah, handwriting. My biggest thing is we can read sloppy fine. Don't worry if your handwriting is sloppy. Small is the hardest thing to read. And remember, if they can't read it, they can't grade it. And you want to keep it, again, as easy for them as possible. You want to like draw it out. You want to connect all the dots, right? This supports, da, 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 da. So If you write very small, try to just write bigger tomorrow. But again, sloppy's fine. We can most of the time read sloppy. It's just a really tiny handwriting that's super hard because all of the like O's, E's, A's, B's, P's, they all look the same when you start doing the circles. So that was a good point. Handwriting. Remember to circle the one for the DBQ. And then if you're picking, because remember for the LEQ, you get to choose, make sure that for every, and that's just something maybe you can do like at the end, that every piece of paper that you write the DBQ on, you need to do the 1. Every piece of paper that you write your LEQ for, do the 2, the 3, or the 4, and just circle that. For the short answer questions, you only have 1 piece of paper. Like you have 1 response paper, but remember it's short. So you guys will be fine. I don't think I've ever had a student where that was a concern. It's okay to say, I wouldn't say, so the question was, is it fine to just straight up say, this supports blank because of blank? I wouldn't say like, this document supports my thesis because that's kind of annoying, but you can for sure say, this example of economic discrimination among women was one of the causes for the women's rights movement because blank, blank, blank. You know what I mean? So remember to constantly use whatever is in your thesis or whatever it is that you're arguing. Anytime you're trying to earn the supports point for the DBQ, make sure that you're being consistent with that language. If the word economic discrimination is in your thesis, when you're talking about a document, connect it to how it's an example of economic discrimination. Does that make sense? You want to be consistent in that type of way, 100%. And don't think it sounds redundant, because on day 6, hour 6 of grading AP exams, they're going to read your essay and they're going to be like, thank God for this kid, all the points. Let's just give them all the points. This kid knows what they're talking about. Because you kind of get a little bit biased. You're like, yeah, this kid totally knows what they're doing. Yeah, I'm going to give them all the points. Whereas kids that say really stupid things, you think that they're not very smart. And so you have to question everything. Like, ooh, did they get that point? So you don't want them to question you. You want to be like, I know what I'm doing. But you will. You guys are already writing so much better than some of the ones I've read before at the AP reading. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine. So the question was, it'll seem kind of clunky, but what if at the end we've got time, we want to just add in the unicorn point at the end? I think that that's a perfect place to do it. You have to remember it's such a difficult point to earn. 3% of the kids worldwide earn the unicorn point because it has to be perfect. It has to be the perfect scenario. It has to support your thesis. It has to be relevant. It has to be from the right, like a different time period. The stars have to kind of align. And again, that's going to be just like, how much content do you know? How quickly your brain is thinking in that 1 hour. So don't be too hard on yourself about unicorn point. But yes, you can put it at the end. You can also put it with a document. If there's a certain document and like an argument that you're making with that document, you can put it there as well. So like, again, if we're talking about economic discrimination and that's in your thesis and you're using a certain document to prove that, and you say like, man, this really reminds me of whatever else we learned. I don't know. That's not a very good example, but you can put your unicorn point there. This is very similar to the economic discrimination faced by blah, 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 blah. Does that make sense?
You need to argue that like throughout the essay. Or
yeah, if you have a complex thesis statement.
Okay.
If you have that complex thesis statement where you're looking at, if they just want you to talk about the causes of the women's rights movement and you talk about the effects of it, or if you're talking about the women's rights movement and you talk about the people that are critical of the women's rights movement, like that, the kind of like the counterpoint, and you do that in your essay, then you can earn the complexity point that way.
For the LEQ, it's like, what exactly do we need? Like, I know like context, thesis, but like what else?
Context, thesis, at least, so 2 pieces of SFI that are accurate and relevant and like within the time period. I would try to get 3 or 4 if possible, because that way you have a buffer. That way, if like, let's say that you pick something that's outside of the time period, like if the time period is 1840 to 1900 and you talk about the Missouri Compromise and you're like banking on the Missouri Compromise, well, that was 1820, friend. You're not getting that point. So I would try to do, and even if all you can do and your brain hurts with that LEQ, if you can do some contextualization, so think about the time period beforehand a little bit related to it. Try to get a broad thesis statement in there, but if all you can do is describe and explain some SFI related to it, even if you get a 3 out of 6 on the LEQ, you'll be fine. And did y'all see the score calculator? Have we all looked at that? Is it what is it? Albert IO something. Have y'all seen this? So most of you guys, when you took the practice exam, let's just be like conservative and say like, yeah, 40 something there. I mean, look, 2 out of 3, 2 out of 3. I think that most of you guys can score a 4 or a 5, you know, on the DBQ. Even if you get a 3 out of 6, some of you guys were, you know, up in here. I mean, hopefully we can get some 3s on the SAQ. Let's see what we need to get a 5. That's not bad. Yeah. And remember, only about 10% of nationwide get 5s. I would say in a normal year, if you have an A in my class, you should be getting a 5 on the AP exam. This year, my class was a little easier. So a 4 or a 5, if you have an A, you should be getting a 4 or a 5, I would say. Yep. If you have a B, a 3 or a 4, it's kind of like that buffer. You never know, or they could just like straight up like curve it really well, and maybe it is true. Maybe you do deserve the 5 this year. I think you all deserve 5s this year. Yeah, tomorrow you need a pen for your FRQs, a pencil for the multiple choice. Do you need an ID? You do need an ID? Okay. I didn't know that.
Probably bring him just in case anyway.
I was about to say, I'll be there at 7:30 in the hallway. And so if I need to identify you, I can do that. Yeah, I think that counts as a teacher ID. Like a teacher can identify you. I can just sign off. I guess, I don't know. I've never met some of you, so. All right. Do you guys have any other questions? Anything else I can help you with? Just moral support? I'll see you in the morning. My son, Jackson, we have a tradition in my house, except for last year, obviously. Where ever since Jackson was a baby, he would come with me on AP exam mornings to wish you guys good luck. So my 7-year-old son will be with me tomorrow to wish you good luck. It was really cute when he was like a toddler and he was like teeter-tottering around in the morning. It was really good. It like calmed everybody down. And tomorrow is my youngest son is turning 4 tomorrow, but he'll be at preschool. But we will see you bright and early tomorrow morning to.
Can you go over the room designations real quick?
You will be in Mr. Burkowski's room because you're a C.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then I think the cutoff was like M. I think it was M. M starts with Mr. Miller's room. Oh, that's a good way to remember it. So M through Z is in Mr. Miller's room. But I will print that out. Ooh, I won't have it printed out, but I'll have it on my phone where I can help you guys with that tomorrow. Cool. All right, if you want to hang out and ask any type of question, totally can. Otherwise, I'll see you in the morning. Go to bed early. Eat a good breakfast.